Okay, kia ora, hui mai tātou. Nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Welcome to everyone in the room here, and welcome to those who are watching this live streamed. We're very lucky. My name is John Ryle. I'm chairing the session tonight. We're very lucky to have with us Susan Robson, who's a lawyer. We all love lawyers. And has worked as the chair of the Social Security Appeal Authority, was a member of the Employment Relations Authority, and has been involved in other bodies such as that. The reason she's here tonight is to talk about a subject very close to her heart, and which she's done a lot of work on, which is around employment institutions. And employment institutions, for those who don't know about them, are institutions such as the Employment Relations Authority, the Employment Court, and other tribunals. And it's really the issue that Susan is raising with us, is that since the Employment Contracts Act was got rid of by our Labour Alliance government in 1999, have things got better in terms of a collectivist approach to employment relations? So I'll hand it over to Susan to talk about the topic she's discussing tonight and to give her presentation. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, John. This talk has had many titles. Today's title is A Technocratic Approach to the Revival of Collectivised Labour Relations. And by technocratic, I mean data-driven. Data being the history of labour relations over the last 4 decades that tells us about government policies and their outcomes. Did the claims made for the policy achieve the desired result? If not, why not? How have policies for a return to collectivised labour relations been stymied? New Zealand moved abruptly from a collectivised to an individualised labour relations environment, from labour relations to the labour market, following the 1990 election. That environment is still with us. So the issue is, what might kickstart a change? The data, or the history, suggests that the key to change lies in a focus on dispute resolution mechanisms and institutions. The major lesson of this period is that those are the mechanisms that guarantee the success or the failure of the policy choice between individualised and collectivised labour cultures. Policy about labour relations or the labour market since 1987 has been enacted in 4 pieces of legislation: the Labour Relations Act 1987, the Employment Contracts Act 1991, the Employment Relations Act 2000, and more recently the Fair Pay Act of 2022. The Labour Relations Act was an attempt to update the collectivist model in the face of declining union membership, but it was the product of a government with conflicting attitudes to economic headwinds and a much more sympathetic view of the role of the rule of law and the legal profession in labour relations. The Employment Contracts Act, in existence for 9 years only, was the product of a National Party election campaign promise to deregulate the labour market. Freedom of contract was the rallying cry. Sponsored by the Business Roundtable, it sought to rid labour relations of unions and individualise the relationship between employers and employees, who would be free to conclude their own contracts of employment. Its success in doing so remains, but only because that success has been underpinned by Labour governments in the period since. Their response, the Employment Relations Act, is still in effect 24 years after it began. It survived a 3-term national government with its collective provisions intact. They were not a threat to a flexible labour market. The Fair Pay Act may well have been similarly doomed with a different election result, in large part as the result of the failure by Labour government policymakers to connect dispute resolution mechanisms to policy survival. So that connection is the subject of this talk. To illustrate why the role of the current dispute resolution regime has guaranteed the success of the policy for the Employment Contracts Act and undermined that of the Employment Relations Act, what follows is a description of their dispute resolution options and an analysis of what worked and what didn't. My hope is to show that dismantling the current dispute system as a starting point to policy is key to restoring collective approaches to labour relations. Historically, labour relations from the 1890s through much of the 20th century relied on institutions that had conciliation and arbitration functions for unions and employers. They focused on collective interests, the bargaining for and operation of awards and other documents that set out the terms and conditions of the work they covered. Bargaining and disputes were handled by the officials of the relevant unions and employer associations, and their memberships were required to approve the results. As the 20th century wore on and social and work conditions changed, part of the tension between union and employer interests concerned the means by which disputes were resolved, particularly the increasing professionalisation of the institutions created for this purpose, and the limits on direct action that were traded for formal rights of resolution. Employers saw advantages for their interests in recourse to legal process, but unions regarded legal process as the means by which consideration of substantive issues were either ignored or subsumed. The Labour Relations Act 1987 sought to redress these concerns by legislating for disputes of rights, those are the interpretation of awards, adjudicating of grievances and other actions regarded as legal matters, to be dealt with ultimately by the Labour Court. This opened the door to labour disputes to the legal profession, previously barred from involvement, so that by 1989, in a consultation with unions and employers, the Department of Labour recorded rising dissatisfaction by union members with the increased formality or legalism of the institutions under the new Act, but a positive view of the changes by employer representatives who celebrated the increased sanctions the court made available to employers. Much of the content of the Employment Contracts Act was drafted in the period leading up to the 1990 general election, but the new government was split ideologically on the appropriate dispute resolution system. The Radicals, headed by the Minister of Finance, Ruth Richardson, were headquartered in the Treasury. They wanted to abolish the specialist labour jurisdiction so that disputes would be dealt with by the civil courts. The moderates had the Minister of Labour, Bill Birch, in their corner. The Departments of Labour and Justice and the State Services Commission reported to him, and they favoured reliance on existing specialist institutions, the Mediation Service and the Labour Court, which are and were the institutions of collectivist labour relations. In essence, the debate was about the personal grievance jurisdiction. Personal grievances were introduced in 1973 as a means of averting collective action arising from conflicts confined to individuals that were, until 1991, resolved by personal grievance committees composed of union and employer representatives, as they were then available only to union employees. Initially, the Radicals sought a clean slate approach based on voluntary contracting and the common law of contract. Ameliorative contracts legislation would not apply, and minimum wage, holidays and health and safety legislation would be repealed, something similar to what the current workplace minister is suggesting as policy. The moderates, on the other hand, favoured extending grievances to all employees as the basis of rendering union membership less attractive, but retaining the specialist jurisdiction to deal with them. The moderates were successful in the bid to extend grievance rights and to retain a specialist jurisdiction for conflict. They were unsuccessful in a bid to retain existing institutions until the new legislation bedded in. It took a select committee process to determine the type and shape of the new institutions, an employment tribunal that would arbitrate judicially, but quickly and informally, and an employment court that would operate chiefly as an appeal body with oversight of the tribunal, but also at which some limited actions could be commenced. The focus on the structure of these institutions came at the expense of consideration of the policy evidence from Justice and Labour ministries about other requirements of high-frequency resolution institutions. Justice had long experience of the effect of lawyer requirements of these institutions and warned accordingly. These warnings were ignored, as was the implication of a transition from collective, unions and employer associations, to individualist representation. And they are crucial to understanding why the legislative objective for low-level, speedy and informal dispute resolution was subverted over the term of the Employment Contracts Act. The way that the Employment Tribunal functioned from mid-1991 to 1999 fulfilled both moderate and radical policy desires, labour market acceptance of a change from collective to individualised conflict resolution, and employment at will. Notwithstanding this, both the tribunal and the court came under sustained criticism, the tribunal from the public for endemic delay, and the court from the national government for its preference for process over substance in dismissal grievances. The Labour Department, charged with administering the jurisdiction, was hopelessly ill-equipped to cope with the demands of an entrepreneurial legal profession previously excluded from grievance resolution, suddenly gifted a new source of income, employers who perceived increased powers to fire at will, and white-collar and professional employee views of the economic advantages of challenging dismissals and the widespread publication of their successes. In 1989, there were 125 grievances per 100,000 union members. 10 years later, that figure had doubled per 100,000 employees, and dismissal PGs formed 80% of the work of the tribunal. United States legal academics had long known by then that any and every dispute resolution mechanism that relied on the legally trained, no matter what the policy or intentions for them were, quickly fell victim to what they called adversarial legalism, increased rates of disputing, formalism, decision-making, and, importantly, delay. Thus, applications and the numbers of claims per application increased year on year. Of the two modes of resolution on offer, mediation and adjudication, the latter was the preference for 2/3 of applicants, even after it became apparent that the dominant and quicker mode of resolution was mediation. The cost to the state per adjudication was higher than the amount likely to be awarded if the grievant was successful. Adjudications took 6 to 8 times longer than mediation, without the time needed for a written decision, and increasingly required more than one hearing or decision. It was only when the delay engendered by adjudication became apparent, then endemic, that mediation came into its own as the means by which applications could be resolved earlier. These problems were exacerbated by the ban imposed by the Employment Court on allowing mediators to arbitrate at the end of a failed mediation, as they were empowered to do under the previous system. The influx of lawyers also transformed the point at which institutional intervention in this jurisdiction occurred. For collective advocates, it was available when discussion and negotiation failed to produce a settlement, but for lawyers, it was the means by which negotiation began. Institutional intervention became the first rather than the last step in the resolution process. Lawyers were, however, available to all comers, took their fees from remedies, were associated with the vindication of individual rights and redress, won and publicised lottery-like compensation awards, and so ensured that rights of grievance were perceived to be superior to or an adequate substitute for membership of unions and employer associations. The result, higher proportions of employees who could be dismissed, effectively at will, so long as there remained the promise of money as the means of exchange, was crucial to widespread employee acceptance of this particular bargain. The price they paid had been the subject of extensive analysis not reflected in the popular press. The capacity of short-term labour market flexibility undermined that of long-term flexibility, traditional relativities, and comparative wage justice. So whilst some types of work, salaried, managerial, tech, attracted large increases in pay and conditions, others went substantially backwards. Grievance success rates also changed, from no lower than 57% prior to 1991 to no higher than 52% subsequently. A desire to address the defects of the Employment Contracts Act structure became the sole driver of institutional reform when policy for the Employment Relations Act was being decided. It thus crowded out alternatives and ensured that the problems of the immediate past dominated policy for the new legislation. This focus on the bogey of legalism failed, however, to provoke ideas of abandoning the legalist model altogether. The provisions on collective bargaining for collective employment agreements also failed to prompt any reflection on the existing dispute resolution model. At issue, therefore, was the effect of legal process on tribunal operations, the court's review function with the rights of appeal, preference for adjudication over mediation, and the absence of effective triage mechanisms. The policy process was dominated in the assessment of alternatives to legalism by the need to confront and frustrate the behaviour of legalist advocates. The mediation service became a semi-mandatory first port of call, separated off from the adjudicative bodies, the Employment Relations Authority and the court, neither of which could proceed to hear and determine claims in the absence of attempts at mediation. Mediators were conferred a range of powers in keeping with the policy desire to focus on mending rather than ending employment relationships. And that was the big policy focus of the Employment Relations Act. The authority was to have an inquisitorial or investigative rather than an adversarial function, with an emphasis on procedural informality, whilst the court lost its review function over the way the authority operated in particular claims. Appeals, therefore, had to focus on the substance of the employment relationship problem rather than the way it was heard and determined. A major focus of the new legislation was on the language describing the nature of the relationship between employer and employee. The Employment Contracts Act referred to it as a contract, Employment Relations Act preferred relationship. This was a reference back to the Labour Relations Act, which was replaced by the Employment Contracts Act, an attempt to emphasise the relational over the contractual nature of the connection. Another attempt to roll back a decade of contractualism, and perhaps the most telling of the changes in terms of employment outcomes subsequently, was the provision of reinstatement as the primary remedy for individual grievances. Key to understanding the new government's position was the view articulated for the Minister of Labour in early 2001 in an Employment Law Bulletin article, that individualism and collectivism could flourish side by side, and this is what was said. Balancing the rights of individuals and promoting collectives presented quite a challenge to ensure that the legislation catered for both diversity and flexibility while addressing the fundamental issue of inequality in the workplace. Now, the mediation service, once they got going, was an immediate success in terms of what became its major function, triage, which operated to dramatically reduce the number of problems requiring adjudication once advocates learned that it, not the authority, was the institution of first resort. It became, however, the place where problematic relationships were finally put down, powers reduced in action to presiding over the terms of dissolution rather than the means by which they could be mended or improved. The policy hopes that the shuttle style of Employment Contracts Act mediation would be overtaken by other approaches and the need for legal representation at mediation diminish were never met. Within 5 years, it was possible to describe typical participants in a mediation, a short relationship, less than 4 years, neither belonging to a union or employer association, both dependent on advice from lawyers or advocates whose fees were derived from ending rather than mending the relationship, and who were unable or unwilling to negotiate the terms of dissolution with each other directly. This underlines what a US academic had been saying since the 1980s about the false hopes that informal dispute resolution structures offer. He found it ironic that institutions publicly justified by the ideal of community and targeted at disputes arising in ongoing relationships serve instead to dissolve community and to terminate relationships by facilitating exit. And that's what happened to reinstatement as a primary remedy. It never stood a chance as a result of its vulnerability to an essentially unchanged institutional dispute resolution structure, which might explain why there was so much publicity about Kmart reinstatement a few days ago. That's because it's so rare. The authority benefited from the introduction of a functioning triage system, the requirement for mediation before adjudication. This solved the problem of delay that beset the tribunal, at least in the beginning. But its investigative or inquisitorial function never really stood a chance. New Zealand's legal system is based on the British common law system that depends on adversarial style advocacy and judgment. Cross-examination by advocates is regarded as key to this process, the system that New Zealand lawyers are trained in and that they insist upon. So they were never likely to accept investigative or inquisitorial approaches that hand the cross-examination function to the decision maker. Within weeks of the authority's commencement, a manufactured crisis saw the employment court step in to impose cross-examination on authority investigations, the first of a series of decisions that illustrate how long it took the court to adjust to the abolition of its review function over the authority. It was about a decade. Aside from a handful of applications annually on the subject of strikes and lockouts, the court's major source of work, like the authorities, concerns individual employment issues, employment status, are you an employee or a contractor, and personal grievances. It also fell victim to another phenomenon described by that US legal academic, the rising need to deal with ancillary over substantive issues. A quick look at the Employment Court website of its decisions reveals that for every judgment on the merits of a claim, there are at least 4 or 5 on the procedural or costs issues of an application. Reinstatement as a remedy fell by the wayside within a year or two of the new regime. So, what does this history tell us? It tells us that National Party policy has consistently favoured the involvement of the legal profession and its institutions because it has always recognised the connection between its desired policy outcomes and dispute resolution systems reliant on legal process. It is now clear, however, that the debate between the radicals and the moderates in 1991 about the type of legal process necessary for a flexible labour market was unnecessary. Informal, low-status legal processes are as efficacious as high-status formal processes at achieving desired policy outcomes. Until 1987, Labour Party policy also recognised this connection because collective dispute resolution mechanisms excluded or limited the application of legal processes to labour relations. Its failure to recognise the connection and its belief that individual and collective labour relations policy goals could be met by improving legal processes has fatally undermined its policy hopes for labour relations over the last quarter century. The dispute resolution system was the only aspect of the Employment Contracts Act that was subject to a consultation process. The most successful element of the Employment Contracts Act, the move to a flexible labour market, individualising labour relations, remains. It was not the subject of consultation. So, closing, what might a collectivised dispute structure look like? It would encompass all labour relations issues, and it would be dominated by the union and employer collectives necessary to negotiate and maintain workplace regulation in all its forms. It would be supported by a government department akin to the previous Labour government that would operate as the clearinghouse for labour relations policy and assistance, have regulatory and enforcement functions, be required to engage relevant collectives for resolution purposes, collective and individual, and provide training facilities and personnel to enable them to do so. It would also have responsibility for arranging proxies for collectives unable or unwilling to bargain for terms of employment. All comers, regardless of collective membership, would be subject to collective-dominated dispute resolution, with non-members required to meet all associated resolution costs. Given that most conflict is resolved informally, the involvement of collective officials who develop relationships of trust and confidence with their opposite numbers should be accorded priority in system design. They would form an important triage function. They should be supported by a mediation and conciliation service with the wide powers that already exist in the Employment Relations Act, so that the number of intractable matters that require more specialised assistance remains low and is confined to collective rather than individual issues. A specialist court would hear and determine claims lodged exclusively and only by collectives. Any individual who sought to claim would have to do so via the relevant collective, which could either accept or decline to do so. And lastly, transitioning to collectivism, system design and the relevant legislative drafting should be completed before the election of a government prepared to implement collectivised labour relations. Taking a leaf from the National Party preparation of the Employment Contracts Act, such preparation should occur in confidence and proceed legislatively, whatever route does not require consultation. Given that the most powerful collective in New Zealand, the Law Society, would be facing the extinction of an important business opportunity, it is imperative it does not have the opportunity to oppose the transition. Introduction of the new system should be accompanied by an intensive all modes information campaign that highlights its benefits for small employers, the one cohort that would be most advantaged by a collectivised system, but is also the cohort most opposed to one. The aim for political collectivised system is that it becomes more acceptable to small employers than the existing model, so that meeting their needs is regarded as a priority. So I welcome engagement on this very dry and technical set of issues.
Thanks, Susan. We've got some very experienced people in the room who have been through some of those struggles in the 1990s about the future of the institutions. And we've got some people here who have been dealing with recent developments. There was just one question I wanted to ask you, Susan, before I hand the mic out to other people. Is if you look at the Fair Pay Act, which was the act that the Labour government introduced to bring in industry, cross-industry fair pay agreements. Now, in that case there, the principal representative of Business New Zealand, was totally opposed to it and refused to participate. And there was also no industry employer organisations left to actually take up that role. So I just wonder, like, if we're moving to a system that you're envisaging, how do you actually recreate an employers' collective system when one doesn't exist, or in fact, employers may oppose it?
Yes, for my sins, I had to go very carefully through and summarise each and every provision of the Fair Pay Act, and what struck me about it was its focus on attempting to ensure that employers engaged with the system. There's a huge amount of energy that clearly went into recognising that that was the major problem. That's why I indicated in here that the government department that would support a collectivised system would have the power to organise proxies. It's my view, and I don't think there were powers for the registrar under the Fair Pay Act to do, I think, something similar, but it wasn't really spelt out. It seems to me that one of the motivating factors for the business community would be having a public sector institution organising its proxies for it. It might start coming to the table if there was someone else going to be appearing in their stead. That's just, that's a terrible assumption on my part, but it seems that that will be what would, because you're right, they would start by refusing, but if there was someone that was going to be operating in their absence, you would think that they might start to rethink their strategy.
You know, I think the default in the Fair Pay Act was that the Employment Relations Authority would impose an agreement. They would fix an agreement, whether in fact you appeared or not as an employer. But I'll just see if there's other questions that people have got of Susan's presentation.
Just to clarify this.
Oh yes, I'm supposed to give you this.
Sorry, really interesting paper, but I just trying to get my head around it, Susan. That really related to John's question. When you speak of collective, are you speaking of national collective associations, or are you talking about collectives on a sector basis? And if you're talking about collectives, are those collectives by prescription, or are they legal prescription, or are they collectives by voluntary association?
Yeah, so you can tell that I left that delightfully vague. I don't have a view on what that should be. It seems to me that that would be something that needed to be sorted out by people who know a lot more about the functioning of those organisations than I do currently. So I don't know the answer. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry, I just thought I might have missed something. Thank you.
I think that there is a huge amount in getting something like this up and running. A huge focus on what the collectives will be and how they will be managed, I guess, and how their relationship with the Labour Department would be managed. But it seems to me that the collectives working with the department would be the ideal. If it was achievable or not, I'm not in a position to know.
Is there further questions? Well, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems to me in employment matters that the real thing that New Zealand's very good at is restructuring, and we either so it comes down to employer power, whether it's a chief executive of a government department or a private chief executive or whatever, is that if they want to get rid of somebody, they just restructure the organisation, or like what's happening at the moment. Of what the government's doing is saying, just get rid of a whole lot of people. You're going to have a restructure whether you like it or not. And in terms of power, it just seems to me that, when I used to work for ACC, for example, you had some little manager had to prove themselves, so they restructured and made it regional. And then another manager came along a few years, we stuffed up, we'll have to make it national body. And then recently, for example, ACC restructured and realised that about 5 years ago, they just all have to bring them back. And it just seems to me the whole question in terms of dispute resolution is that you have to deal with that whole thing some way, and it's really about neoliberalism, giving power to employers, giving power to chief executives, and the way we actually have it, we have a very power centre, and I don't know, the employment court or whatever, I think they're bloody useless at changing that. And that's the problem at the moment, I think. Anyway, how does restructuring fit into your system?
Well, if you've got a workforce that's collectivised, position to engage on some of those decisions, or they should be able to engage on almost all of those decisions. And one of the reasons that that doesn't happen now is because they're not necessarily well collectivised. I'm not sure if that answers.
That's one of the reasons. It's all about power, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And redressing it, the imbalance, yeah.
Further questions?
Thanks very much. Yeah, a lot to think about, or you gave a lot of interesting stuff, Susan, and quite complex. And my questions are a bit more simplistic. I was just wondering about, it might be a question for John, how did the Christine Bartlett case sort of measure up? I mean, it was both a legal case and a campaign kind of approach. Was the legalistic kind of approach a barrier in the Bartlett, or in the pay equity kind of fight, and it did focus very much on a legal kind of front. And the second question I had was for Susan, was how do you think that the Fair Pay Act measured up to the collectivism approach, in your view, based on what you would ideally, think would be a good employment relations?
Well, my view of that, I'll go first. Of the Fair Pay Act is that it was so focused on getting employers to the bargaining table that seemed to take up most of its provisions. So it was very, very focused on getting bargaining started. And I think, and that's because of the individualised environment that we're in. And I guess this goes back to Ross's question as well. If employees become more collectivised, because that's actually the only way they're going to get access to conflict resolution mechanisms, you're going to see an increase in workplaces of union members, and that of itself means that there's a much easier way through to an equal or a more equal power relationship with the employers. So in the Bartlett situation, you would not, the Bartlett issue had to be referred to the court because there wasn't really a sufficient number in terms of the staff to withdraw labour, for instance, until the issue got resolved. So that's why we're using the court mechanisms at the moment, because of that huge power imbalance that currently exists.
Well, there was a sufficient number, wasn't it? But maybe not sufficient power.
Yes.
John might.
In terms of the Bartlett case in particular, the courts were used as a point of leverage to get the funder involved in bargaining. We could have kept pursuing the one employer, which was Terra Nova, who would have gone into bankruptcy, and in fact was threatening that. So the further up you went in the court system, the more the government then wanted to get involved. So and the Equal Pay Act was a little different then than what it is now. But the institutions were still the same: the Employment Relations Authority, the Employment Court, and the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court. There's one other question I had for Susan around the comment she was making about the primary test in the Employment Relations Authority. The primary remedy is to, if someone takes a claim for unjustified dismissal, is reinstatement. And that hasn't, that's quite a rare case where that happens. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can sort of add more to why that is.
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, that the publicity around that Kmart one actually provides the answer to that. Clearly, her lawyer or her advocate got an interim hearing before the Employment Relations Authority with footage, the camera footage. This is one of those occasions when surveillance capitalism works for the worker, because everything was so surveilled in Kmart that they were able to show to the Employment Relations Authority member the whole camera footage of what happened, and a picture being worth 1,000 words, or it's certainly worth a whole lot of witnesses. If you can see a 5-minute clip, you don't need to listen to 3 or 4 days of witnesses with their view of what was actually happening. The member could see it, and they could see that the employer's response was completely inappropriate. That's the way I took it, anyway. And so for that reason, they ordered reinstatement until the matter can be resolved. And this gets to the nub of why reinstatement hasn't worked. And that's because it takes too long to go through all the various... that's why the employer has such power. So as soon as you dismiss, then it's over to the employee to make all moves to undo that dismissal. And if it's going to take you 6 months, you're out of the workplace for 6 months, and everyone gives up, really. It's not, that's just the way it works.
Thanks, Susan. Further questions? Bill.
Yeah, it was a very interesting talk, thanks, Susan. And in a way, what you're expressing there is that the Employment Contracts Act was set up to be completely individualised, and the only kind of institution that they really needed was for personal grievances, and all the rest was just going to happen, you know, through the workings of the markets, and everything would be great, and of course it wasn't. And the response to that is, and I think you've identified it, is that the really important thing is collectivisation. Yeah. And that's about not only union membership, but it's about collective agreements and collective organisation. Yes. You've given one possible way of incentivising the formation of those, which is to say you can't have a personal grievance unless you're in a collective of some sort, which I might be misrepresenting you there, but essentially I think that's...
Unless a collective agrees to take it on your behalf if it can't be resolved by negotiation or mediation.
Right. So I've got 2 questions really about that. One is if you can see other ways. Clearly we need to have a better structure to encourage sectoral bargaining and collectivisation. Yeah. And the fair pay agreements were one approach to that. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on other ways to do that you would see would be effective, and the mediation and arbitration, or whatever other accompaniment you need from the point of view you're talking about here. And the second point is that, that fair pay agreements were a huge step in that, but as you're describing, they actually reflect the weakness of the current situation, where we've got an absence not only of a large degree of unionisation, but a complete absence of organisation of employers other than as lobbying groups in their own benefit. And maybe that's the way we have to go. In fact, that's what we decided. That's the way we had to go. But there were also some controversies even in that method as to how the decisions would be made if bargaining broke down, which was highly likely because the employers were saying, we won't come to the table. But you know, there were a number of choices in terms of mediation, arbitration, all those kinds of things that I don't completely understand. But I'd be interested in your views of what, you know, if we did have go back to a fair pay, with the new government, we went back to the fair pay agreements, whether those kinds of remedies were the best way to go that were in the Act, or whether you saw some better ways of doing it.
I'm not going to quibble with what was in the Fair Pay Act about collectivising and getting going on bargaining. But you touched on what I think is an absolutely crucial point, and that is the collectivising of employers, particularly small employers. What the research that I've done reveals is that they are the most exercised by what they regard as employment over-regulation and the ones that are constantly seeking parliamentary help with the situation that they're in. But they also can't recognise, or they don't be able to recognise, that the current system affects them almost the worst, because they're the ones that get to pay the price of having to dismiss employees that they can't work with or whatever. And it becomes very difficult for them, but they're not. They tend to be, in terms of their thinking, loners, or I'm trying to find a way through this. Anyway, they don't recognise lie, put it that way. But I feel some optimism that if there was another way that they could see was helpful, if they belonged, for instance, to an employers' association that then was able to assist them with employment relationship problems as they arose, rather than down the track, which is what now happens, because they don't really have access to good advice about maintaining or having good employment relationships. It's only when things go bad that they have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to be told how to put it right. So I guess that's why I see the small employer cohort as key to any system like this in terms of its success. I don't know if that's answered your question or not. I'm sorry.
Simon, did you want to... any further questions?
Kia ora. My name's Claire. I'm a high school teacher and PBTA member. So just on the note of towards labour relations that are collectively based in the current situation with the Employment Relations Act being that the dispute resolution stipulations are prioritise individual relationships with employers. Politically, what do we going to take to actually get movement back towards a collective relationship with employers? Yeah. And maybe anyone could answer this potentially. But, yeah.
Pressure, really. Public pressure. I had to think about that issue whilst I was writing this, because I can't see that moment. I wish I could, but I can't really. But I think that it will happen at some point. I mean, I look around now and I think that one of the things that's happening for my generation's children and our grandchildren is that there's a much greater acceptance of what we've lost in terms of collectivity and the advantages of collectivity. There's much greater respect now for Māori and Pacific cultures and their collective stance and focus. And so I'm kind of looking in that direction and thinking that that may be where the root lies. I can't see it in our generation.
But didn't the Fair Pay Act make that step? I mean, I think probably the best tactic is the Fair Pay Act initiative on CQ's part demonstrated was actually starting with the most vulnerable groups of workers and actually through that demonstrating the value to those vulnerable workers. And it just so happens that a large proportion of those vulnerable workers are Pacific and Māori.
Yes.
And other migrant workers too are also pretty vulnerable.
Yes, and
so maybe the Fair Pay Act was a good step. Maybe it could have been a much better step if it had retained the strength that it was proposed and it had actually been legislated early in the first term of a Labor government. But you know, there are a whole lot of ifs. But
with respect to the Fair Pay Agreement, though, do you think that the broad brush approach, as opposed to maybe targeting certain industries or certain sectors of the economy, but you know, and getting agreements across the line with those, as using those as a benchmark to then move forward, as opposed to trying to take on a whole swathe of industries and put them into one sort of category and then try and get it over the line? Do you think, I mean, strategically, felt to me that was possibly, go for foodstuffs, go for progressives and those organisations, get those things over the line and then look to develop it from there.
Yeah, well, of course, my point is that you set up the dispute resolution system first and then those strategies will follow. So my major point is that setting up the collective domination of the resolution system is the first step, and it's and because it hasn't been, well, it was for the Employment Contracts Act really, but it hasn't been subsequently, because dispute resolution is always regarded as the last thing you do. That's always the last thing in a contract, or near the end. It's near the end in all statutes. But in my view, it needs to be the thing that you start with. I know it does seem counterintuitive, but that if you start with the dispute resolution system, I think everything else starts to fall into place once you have to prepare for that.
Just a comment on the Fair Pay Act. I was on the working group with Jim Bolger that produced the report in the end of 2018. It took a long time after that to actually get legislation into Parliament. I agree with Susan that there was quite a bit of effort put into trying to get employer groups on board and even offering them money to actually organise themselves together. The problems with the Act, I mean, there's sort of three things to this. One is the law. The other is the organisation of workers and employers. And the third one is, what is the third one? The third one is about the politics of it. And so in terms of that Fair Pay Act, there were some problems with it in terms of the various timelines for everything, which were built into it to help employers really get themselves organised. And those timelines were problematic to unions who were organised and had organised their own members and the wider workforce, because they kept delaying things. The other problem was with these things, the political issue with it, was that unions needed to be political. And I'm not saying political with a big P, I'm saying political with how they approached it. And I agree with you, Simon, that there were a couple of initiated fair pay agreements which were so wide they were bound to outrage every employer in that group because they were non-natural industries. Some of them are very clear industries who still had employer groups who organised in that industry, but others, I thought it was a nutty strategy to actually try and get those up. Bus drivers was obviously one that had some sympathy. Cleaners did as well, as with security guards, but there were some others that I thought weren't that great. The other thing about the Fair Pay Act is that it did have an important point in it. It wasn't just bargaining in the industry, but it was a threat of arbitration and a decision if you didn't reach agreement, which had pressure on both parties, both employers and unions, to actually come to a negotiated decision because they couldn't be certain of what the arbitration body, the Employment Relations Authority, would impose on them. For a union, that could be something they didn't want. It could be seen as a defeat. For the employers, it could be something which they felt they couldn't afford. So I think the Fair Pay Agreement was one step in the process. It doesn't deal with the point Susan is making about individual disputes, whether they're grievances, whether they're interpretations of agreements, or whether there are other disputes. I think that sort of is still problematic, and I am interested in what Susan's saying about trying to incorporate the two together. So the collective process isn't just about collective bargaining, but it's about the wider issue of industry issues, interpretation issues, grievances of individuals, etc. So I think that's just a reply to the point about the Fair Pay Act, which I thought was a giant step, but others didn't so much. Is there any further comments?
Have to be the last question. Just to...
The question I have, you've talked a lot about collectivity, which is significant. How do you see the process going forward of the collectivity of the PSA within the public service and how they're going to relate to what's happening in relation to who their employer is? Are there going to be disputes or conflicts because of what has been designated as government policy relating to staffing. How do you see that playing out? Because it clearly is a major area of employment dispute for those who are losing their jobs. The PSA is a collectivity organisation, and all those public servants who belong to the PSA are a collectivity. How do you see that huge collectivity managing progress in resolving that, if it's possible?
Well, with difficulty under the current system, really,
Yeah.
because the numbers don't enable anyone to get together to withdraw or to impose any form of, or to engage in any form of action that might cause a bit of a rethink.
Well, it's not numbers, it's law. I mean, the 1973 personal grievance provisions in the Adult Industrial Relations Act were introduced in exchange for the right to strike over disputes.
Yes.
So that was the beginning of a legislated disputes process to restrict the right to strike. So, I mean, it's actually the law that's restricting.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I also say that the case that the PSA are taking now against the Ministry of Education is that the cuts breach the collective agreement and the management of change is one really interesting step that's going on, and I'm just surprised that there aren't other ministries, department, or other collectives in the public sector not taking the same approach. But the PSA have got their hands pretty full with completely over swamped. But that case is a very interesting case.
But it sort of underlines that point, doesn't it? That it's judges that are making the kinds of decisions for employers or employees, and not the groups themselves. So you've got to find a legal hook in order to get to the court. And for the education employees, it was the way the ministry dealt with the process. Yeah. If you don't have the hook, you don't have access to a remedy. And you don't have to have those hooks if you're dealing with another group that has a similar access to power as you do, if you see what I mean.
I need to think.
Okay.
I'm trying to work it out, because I think the collective's the hook.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. We've got to the point where it's past 6:30, and so we're running out of time. We'd like to thank everyone at the suite tonight. I'd like to thank Susan for her presentation and the discussion that has provoked. I'm sure it's not going to stop here. I'm sure that's going to continue, because we do need to think out forwardly about what we want when we get an opportunity to change the law to further the rights of workers. I'd like to thank all our people who are on the live stream. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you come to Fabian's sessions in the future. So I'll just finish with Kuamutu tēnei mahi e tēnei wā. Manakantia mai o tātou katoa, o tātou hoa, o tātou whānau, manakantia mai iao i te ao rangi āmene.